It was a cold, dreary evening, and the streets of the city were mostly empty. Alexander Davis, the young and powerful CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation, found himself hiding in the most unlikely of places, a garbage can. How had it come to this? Only hours earlier, he had been seated in his luxurious office, surrounded by wealth and power. But now he was crouched in a filthy alley, desperate to escape a fate he had never asked for. It all started with his parents' plan to marry him off to the daughter of another wealthy family. To them, this marriage was a business deal, a merger of families that would increase their power and influence. But for Alexander, it was suffocating. He didn't love her, he barely knew her, and the thought of being forced into a loveless marriage filled him with dread. His life had always been dictated by his parents. Every decision, every move, but this was the final straw. He wasn't going to let them control him any longer. So, when the engagement party had been announced, Alexander did the unthinkable. Instead of standing in front of hundreds of guests, accepting his fate, he fled, with no time to think, no time to plan. He ran through the city, hoping to find some kind of refuge, somewhere no one would think to look for him. That's how he ended up here, hiding in a garbage can, his expensive suit ruined, his heart pounding in his chest. He could still hear his parents' angry voices in his mind, telling him he was throwing everything away. But what good was money and power if he couldn't even control his own life? Just as he thought he could catch his breath, the sound of footsteps echoed through the alleys. His heart raced again. He stayed as still as possible, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing. But the footsteps came closer, and then, to his horror, the lid of the garbage can was lifted. Standing above him was a young woman, her face framed by tangled brown hair. She was wearing a simple, worn-out coat, and she had a large bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw him. "What are you doing in there?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. For a moment, Alexander didn't know what to say. How could he explain that a wealthy CEO was hiding in a garbage can to avoid a forced marriage? It sounded ridiculous, even to him, but he couldn't stay silent forever. So he stammered, I needed a place to hide." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. Hide? From what? Alexander hesitated. He didn't want to lie, but the truth seemed too far-fetched. "It's complicated," he finally said. The woman sighed, looking around the alley. "Well, you can't stay in there. It's not safe." Without waiting for a response, she reached out and pulled him out of the garbage can. Alexander stumbled out, feeling completely out of his element. He wasn't used to this, being vulnerable, relying on a stranger's kindness. He was used to giving orders, not taking them. The woman studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You don't look like you belong here," she said, her tone gentler now. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" Alexander looked down at his ruined suit and felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. "You could say that," he muttered. She sighed again, and then, to his surprise, she said, "Well, I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but you can come with me. I don't have much, but I can at least give you a place to stay for the night." Alexander blinked in surprise. He had expected her to walk away, to leave him to figure out his own problems. But instead, she was offering to help him. It was the last thing he had expected. The woman turned and started walking down the alley, glancing back over her shoulder to make sure he was following. Alexander hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should trust her. But what other choice did he have? He couldn't go back, not yet, so he followed her. They walked through the dark streets in silence, the only sound the soft shuffle of their footsteps. Eventually, they arrived at a small, run-down apartment building. The woman led him inside and up a narrow staircase to her apartment. It was a tiny, cluttered space, but it was warm and inviting in a way that Alexander's cold, sterile penthouse had never been. The woman motioned for him to sit down on the couch, and he did. Feeling out of place in this modest home, she disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few moments later with a cup of tea, which she handed to him. "I'm Lily, by the way," she said, sitting down across from him. "Alexander," he replied, taking a sip of the tea. It wasn't the kind of high-end blend he was used to, but in that moment, it was the most comforting thing he'd had all day. Lily looked at him with curiosity. "So, are you going to tell me why you were hiding in a garbage can?" Alexander stared down at the cup in his hands, debating how much to tell her. He barely knew this woman, but something about her made him feel like he could trust her. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't seem interested in his wealth or status. She had no idea who he was. And that was exactly what he needed right now. He took a deep breath and started to speak. "My parents. They're trying to force me into a marriage I don't want. I couldn't do it. So, I ran." Lily's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't interrupt. She just listened, letting him explain. "I know it sounds ridiculous," he said, his voice filled with frustration, "but I've spent my whole life doing what they wanted. And this was too much. I had to get away." Lily nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "That doesn't sound ridiculous at all," she said quietly. "Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even if it means losing everything." Alexander looked at her, surprised by how understanding she was. In that moment, he realized that maybe running away hadn't been such a crazy idea after all. But even as he felt a sense of relief, a new problem loomed on the horizon. What would happen when his family realized he was gone? And more importantly, how long could he stay hidden before his old life caught up with him? Alexander spent the night on Lily's old, worn-out couch, his thoughts racing. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed to grow louder with each passing hour, but his mind was far too restless to allow him any sleep. Everything had changed in the span of a few hours. He had gone from being a powerful CEO, with his future laid out before him, to a man on the run, hiding from his own family and the life they had built for him. As he lay there, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Morning came quickly, the light streaming through the thin curtains in Lily's small apartment. He could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the faint clatter of dishes. The simplicity of it all was startling to him. This was a world so far removed from his own. Yet there was something comforting about it, something real. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't surrounded by people who wanted something from him, people who only saw him as a means to an end. Lily didn't know who he was, and more importantly, she didn't care. She had taken him in, not because of what he could offer her, but simply because she saw someone in need. Eventually, Alexander pulled himself off the couch and made his way into the kitchen. Lily looked up from the stove, where she was frying eggs in a chipped pan. "You sleep okay?" she asked, her tone casual, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for a stranger to be crashing on her couch. Alexander gave a small shrug. "I've had worse nights." She smiled slightly and slid a plate of eggs across the counter toward him. "I don't have much, but it's better than nothing." He looked down at the food, suddenly feeling a wave of gratitude. It wasn't the gourmet breakfast he was used to, but it was made with kindness, and that was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He sat down and took a bite, the simple meal grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. As they ate in silence, Alexander's thoughts drifted back to the chaos he had left behind. He knew it was only a matter of time before his parents started looking for him. They would be furious that he had disappeared on the night of the engagement party. But more than that, they would be determined to bring him back, to fix the problem he had caused. They always did. Lily seemed to sense his unease, because she spoke up after a few moments. "You don't have to tell me everything, but are you really planning on going back?" Alexander shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, I can't. If I go back, they'll just force me into that marriage, and I'll be stuck in that life forever." Lily's expression softened. "It sounds like you've been living under their thumb for a long time. Pretty much my whole life," Alexander admitted, his voice bitter. "They control everything. What I do, who I talk to, even who I marry. It's all about their reputation, their business. I'm just a pawn to them." Lily frowned, clearly trying to wrap her mind around the world he came from. "That sounds awful. But running away, won't they come looking for you?" "They will," Alexander said quietly. "They'll turn the whole city upside down if they have to." Lily sat back, crossing her arms. "So, what's your plan? You can't hide forever." Alexander didn't have an answer to that. He had been so focused on escaping that he hadn't thought about what came next. But she was. Right. He couldn't stay hidden forever. His family's reach was long, and it was only a matter of time before they found him. As if sensing his thoughts, Lily spoke again. "I know it's not much, but you can stay here for a while, if you need to. I don't have a lot, but I won't turn you away." Alexander was taken aback by her offer. He had never met anyone like Lily, someone who was so selfless, despite having so little herself. In his world, everything was transactional. Every relationship came with strings attached. But here, in this small apartment, things were different. She didn't want anything from him, and that was both comforting and terrifying. Over the next few days, Alexander tried to settle into this new life. He helped Lily around the apartment, doing small tasks to repay her kindness. She worked long hours at a local diner, barely making enough to get by, and he couldn't help but feel guilty for imposing on her generosity. He wasn't used to being dependent on anyone, let alone someone like Lily, who was struggling to keep her own life together. But despite the simplicity of their routine, the tension lingered in the background. Every time there was a knock at the door, Alexander's heart would race, half expecting to see his family's security team standing there, ready to drag him back to his old life. The fear of being found gnawed at him constantly, and as much as he tried to enjoy the freedom of this new existence, he knew it couldn't last. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit apartment, Lily finally broke the silence. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice hesitant. "Maybe you need a way out, a real way out." Alexander looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Lily bit her lip, clearly unsure of how to say what was on her mind. "I don't know much about your world, but it seems like your family has a lot of power, right? They're not going to stop until they find you." Alexander nodded. "That's what I'm afraid of." "Well," Lily continued, her voice soft, "what if there was a way to make them think you're gone for good? Like, fake your own disappearance." The idea was so bold, so outrageous, that it took Alexander a moment to process it. He had never considered something like that before. But as Lily explained her plan, a glimmer of hope sparked inside him. It was risky, extremely risky, but it might be the only way to escape his family's grasp for good. As they talked late, into the night, brainstorming ways to pull off the scheme, the tension in the air grew thicker. They both knew that this plan could either save him or destroy everything, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted. Time was running out. His family was getting closer, and the walls were closing in. Soon they would have to make their move. But even as they plotted their next steps, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. As the days passed, Alexander and Lily grew closer, their plan to fake his disappearance becoming more elaborate. They worked in secret, carefully considering every detail, how to leave no trace behind, how to make it believable, and most importantly, how to ensure his family would believe he was truly gone. Alexander could feel the pressure building as they prepared to set their plan in motion. Every day was a waiting game, knowing his family's search would lead them closer and closer to him. But the night before, they were supposed to execute their plan. Something unexpected happened. Lily came home late from her shift at the diner, her face pale and her eyes wide. She barely made it through the door before she collapsed onto the couch, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're looking for you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They were at the diner, asking about a man matching your description. I didn't say anything, but they're close, Alex. Too close." Alexander's heart sank. He had known this day would come, but hearing it out loud sent a chill through him. His family's reach was far wider than he had imagined. If they had tracked him down to Lily's neighborhood, it was only a matter of time before they knocked on her door. "We have to do it tonight," Alexander said, his voice firm. "There's no more time," Lily nodded, her expression determined despite the fear in her eyes. "Let's get it done." They moved quickly, gathering the few supplies they had managed to put together. It wasn't much, just enough to make it seem like Alexander had disappeared without a trace. A few personal items left in odd places, a fake note that hinted he was leaving the city for good, and a stage scene at the riverbank where they would leave his jacket behind. As if he had fallen into the water, by midnight they were ready. The city was quiet as they made their way to the river, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Alexander couldn't help but feel a sense of finality as they approached the water's edge. This was it. Once they put the plan into action, there would be no turning back. As they stood by the river, Lily handed him the jacket he was supposed to leave behind. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her eyes were filled with resolve. "This has to work," she said quietly. Alexander took a deep breath and nodded. "It will." He tossed the jacket onto the ground, making it look like it had been carelessly discarded. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting an eerie glow over the scene. For a moment, everything felt surreal, like they were characters in a story rather than real people with real stakes. But then, just as they were about to leave, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Alexander froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Someone was coming. Before he could react, a group of men appeared from the shadows, their faces grim. Alexander recognized them immediately. His father's security team. They had found him. "Alexander," one of the men said, stepping forward. "It's time to come home." Lily stepped in front of him, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "He's not going anywhere with you." The man barely glanced at her. "This doesn't concern you, miss. Step aside." Alexander's mind raced. They were so close to pulling off the plan, but now it was all falling apart. He couldn't go back. Not after everything he had been through. Not after the freedom he had tasted, however briefly. But he also couldn't let Lily get hurt because of him. "Stop," Alexander said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I'm not going back." The man raised an eyebrow. "Your family wants you back. It's not up to you." "It is up to me," Alexander shot back. "I'm done being their puppet. Tell my father. I'm done with the company, with the marriage, with all of it." There was a long pause, as the man sized him up, clearly surprised by his defiance. But before he could respond, Lily spoke up again. her voice unwavering. "If you take him, you're going to have to answer to me." For a moment, no one moved. The tension was thick in the air, both sides waiting to see who would make the first move. But then, to Alexander's surprise, the security team leader sighed and took a step back. "Fine, have it your way. But know this, your family won't give up on you so easily." With that, the men turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Alexander and Lily standing by the river, their hearts racing. For a long time, they just stood there in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. It wasn't the dramatic climax they had anticipated. No high-speed chase, no daring escape, but it was over, for now at least. Alexander was free. He turned to Lily, his chest tight with gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," Lily shrugged, though there was a hint of a smile on her face. "I wasn't going to let them take you." They made their way back to the apartment in silence, both too exhausted to say much. As they entered the familiar space, Alexander couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, whether his family would come after him again, or if he would truly be able to build a new life. But for the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his own destiny, and that was enough. As they settled in for the night, Alexander glanced over at Lily, who was already half asleep on the couch. He knew he owed her more than just his gratitude. She had saved him in more ways than one. In the days to come, he would figure out how to repay her kindness, how to build a life that was truly his own. But for now, he was content to just be here, in this small, quiet apartment, with the woman who had helped him find his way.